women are not a single group. We are not a single group. Our experiences are shaped by culture, history, geography, class, race, access to education, the quality of education. And when those realities are not acknowledged, the conversation about gender becomes incomplete. We are represented. We are represented. We are represented. Welcome to Represented, the podcast. I'm Aniki Shuru, racial equity coach for online business owners who want to be intentionally inclusive by building a business that is racially equitable. I created this podcast to normalize a conversation around racial inclusion so that fear is no longer the barrier that gets in the way of doing this work. This isn't about perfection, it's about progress. Whether you're taking your first steps or you're well-versed in the journey towards racial equity, this space is for you. So welcome home, friend. Let's get started. From coast to coast, around the globe, we are Hey, welcome back to another episode of Represented Podcast. Now, if you're listening to this episode fresh on the day of publishing and you are based here with me in Australia, then you know yesterday was International Women's Day, which takes place every year on the 8th of March. And the theme for 2026 is Balance the Scales. When I first read that phrase, my mind went in two directions at the same time. And I want to share a little bit about that with you. On the one hand, that phrase carries a sense of hope. It conjures fairness, dignity, and the possibility of a world where women and girls are able to participate fully in society without barriers standing in their way. At the same time, though, it raises a question that I think we do not ask often enough, which is how exactly are we meant to balance the scales when the conditions that created those imbalances in the first place are still very much present around us? Across Australia and globally, we continue to see gender-based violence at deeply concerning rates. We see persistent pay gaps and leadership spaces that often fail to reflect the diversity of the communities they claim to represent. When we talk about balancing the scales, it requires acknowledging that these outcomes did not appear randomly. They are the result of systems and decisions made over many generations that have distributed opportunity very unevenly. And the good news about all of this, which I really love, is that if those systems were built, and we know that they were, this means that they can be changed. But change, as we know, does not happen in government or large institutions. It may seem that way, but really, that's not how change happens. It happens in the everyday decisions made by individuals, including people like you who are listening to this podcast and who are shaping conversations through your businesses, communities, and your leadership. Many of you running coaching programs, memberships, courses, or communities. You facilitate conversations. You introduce new ideas. You recommend books. You collaborate with guest speakers and influence the way people think about leadership and success. Whether you realize it or not, The spaces you lead contribute to the culture that surrounds them. And culture is exactly where scales begin to move. As I started looking at some of the International Women's Day events, as I'm sure maybe you've been doing a little bit of a scroll, and maybe there's some that you'll be attending. If you're an online business owner, it's always good to get up from behind the desk and be amongst the others. If you work in a corporate environment, then there are events, morning teas, special guest speakers coming in for the day to speak. And so there's something that's been organized. And so I was spending some time just having a little bit of a browse and looking around and seeing where are these events being organized, specifically here in Australia, particularly those connected to large national platforms. That's what I was looking at. And I noticed something that I suspect many people notice, but maybe for one reason or another, you don't say it out loud. When you scan the keynote speakers, the faces on the promotional materials, and the voices positioned as authorities on leadership, on women's leadership specifically, the range of perspectives is often much narrower than the word women would suggest. You begin to wonder where the indigenous women are, where the Black women are, the migrant women of color, and whose experiences sit at the intersection of race, culture, and gender, and who are navigating Australian society in ways that many panels never quite capture. So, when certain voices are consistently missing from national conversations about women's advancement, the solutions that emerge from those conversations will inevitably reflect a limited understanding of the challenges women actually face. There is also an important distinction that I want to introduce here because when people talk about balancing the scales, the language of equality and equity is often used interchangeably, even though they describe different ideas. Now, if you've been a student of mine, I am proud to say that you know clearly the difference between equality and equity. But I want to, for the sake of those who do not know what it means, I just want to spend a little bit of time unpacking that. Equality generally refers to treating everyone the same. On the surface, that really sounds fair, right? But what equality does is it assumes that everyone is starting from the same place and has access to the same opportunities. Equity, however, and I love equity for this, recognizes that people begin from very different starting points and that fairness sometimes requires different forms of support so individuals can reach comparable outcomes. And those supports look like perhaps scholarships within your group programs, pro bono, looks like extra support that will meet somebody exactly where they are so that they can be able to potentially catch up with those who haven't had to deal with those particular barriers. In my work, I often go one step further and use the term inequity because inequity directs our attention to the systems and historical conditions that create unfair outcomes in the first place. It invites us to ask how certain groups came to move through institutions with fewer obstacles, while others encounter additional barriers along the way, and systemically always look oppressed, behind, lacking, needing assistance because the system was built inequitably. So when we begin examining inequity, the conversation shifts from treating everyone the same, equally, to understanding the structures that produced the imbalance in the first place. There's another dynamic that often appears in conversations about women's advancement. And this one, uh, scholars and writers have pointed out for many years, and maybe you've had it too. Discussions about women's uh, equality tend to move comfortably, like, oh, yeah, 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 we're all fighting for the same thing until race enters a conversation. At that point, something interesting often happens, and I've witnessed this myself. The conversation becomes hesitant, defensive, or sometimes shifts direction entirely. Instead of examining how race and gender interact within systems of power, the discussion returns to a broader and more comfortable narrative about women as a single group. But what I want you to understand as you listen to this, and I'm sure it'll come through for you, women are not a single group. We are not a single group. Our experiences are shaped by culture, history, geography, class, race, access to education, the quality of education. And when those realities are not acknowledged, the conversation about gender becomes incomplete. This is something Indigenous scholar Eileen Morton Robinson has written about extensively in the Australian context. Her work examines how race, gender, and colonial power intersect within institutions that are often presented as neutral, and we know that they're not. We also see this reflected in the work of Chelsea Watego, who speaks very openly about the emotional labor Indigenous women often carry when raising questions about race in national conversations that prefer to frame inequality in more comfortable terms. Balancing the scales, therefore, requires acknowledging that not all women experience the same barriers and that solutions designed without listening to the most affected by systemic inequity will inevitably always fall short. While I was preparing for this episode, I found myself imagining, what might I say if I was sitting across the table from the organizers of some of these larger International Women's Day events taking place in Australia, including those connected to the UN Women Australia? And the first thing I would encourage them is expanding the range of voices shaping the conversation. Now, you would imagine that that has already taken place, or that's something that has been considered, and maybe it has. But when you get onto some of these websites and you look at the keynote speakers, it is still a very homogeneous looking panel. It doesn't fully represent who we are as a multicultural Australian country. The speaker lineup reflects a narrow demographic. And I know sometimes it's with the best intentions. But what this means is that the conversation about women's advancement risks being incomplete. In fact, it will be incomplete. Australia is home to many thinkers and leaders whose perspectives would deepen these discussions so much more. Indigenous voices, such as those of Larissa Brendant, have contributed enormously to conversations about justice, culture, and leadership. Yet perspectives like these are still not consistently centered in national events about women's progress. My second recommendation would be to move beyond inspiration and into structural analysis. And as somebody who in the past has attended these events, particularly when I was in a corporate space, they were so inspirational. You take a whole load of notes and you're so inspired by somebody's personal story. But there's so much more than just personal story, so much more than just being uplifted, because that's where it stops. And we are stopping short of examining the systems that influence who gains access to the opportunities in the first place. So the person who's sharing their inspirational stories and talking about the barriers, how did they get there in the first place? The system that got them there is still very inequitable. And the third suggestion would be to create spaces for conversations that feel uncomfortable but are necessary for progress. And this is where I particularly get excited about and I lean into this because transformative conversations rarely happen in rooms where everyone already agrees. They emerge when a diversity of perspectives is welcomed and taken seriously. Because if the goal truly is to balance the scales, the conversation must include the women who have historically been pushed to the edges of the room. And we know who those women are. Now, you might be listening to this thinking that these issues primarily belong in corporate boardrooms and national policy discussions. But the truth is that many of the cultural shifts we hope to see in institutions, they often begin in smaller communities led by individuals who are willing to think differently. And you, my friend, are one of those individuals who's choosing to think differently. And how do I know that? Because you're listening to this conversation, you're tuned into this podcast. So, for those of you who are running online businesses, you are already women in leadership roles, whether you describe yourself that way or not. When you host a program, when you teach inside a course, facilitate a community, or bring guest speakers into your container, you're shaping the ecosystem that surrounds your work. Every decision about whose work you cite, whose expertise you introduce to your community, and whose voices you amplify contributes to the culture being created in your space. And that is where balancing the scales becomes deeply personal. So, as we think on International Women's Day during this month of March, and March is very much a month when we amplify women, I want to leave you with a few questions to sit with. Number one, where in your life or business do you currently have influence? And if you belong to a table, any table, even the dinner table, which I feel is one of the most powerful tables you could ever belong to, even more powerful than a boardroom table, you have influence, my friend. Number two, whose voices are present in the spaces you lead? And number three, whose voice might be missing? You see, balancing the scales will take a series of decisions made consistently over time. Decisions that gradually reshape the culture of the communities you and I lead. Because when enough leaders begin to question the systems around them and choose to operate differently, something begins to shift. We begin to see a little bit of a ripple effect, and eventually we reach much further than we imagined. Now, if today's conversation has stirred up something in you, and I really hope it has, and you recognize that you want to examine these dynamics more deeply within your own leadership and business, I want to invite you to join the waitlist for Represented. Represented is a program for online business owners who want to understand racial inequity and how it operates within the coaching and personal development industry, and who are ready to examine their own leadership, marketing, communities that you serve, and the influence that you have through a much more informed lens. Inside Represented, we explore the historical roots of racial inequity, the ways those systems continue to influence modern business environments, and what it means to lead responsibly in a world where representation still requires deliberate attention. If you would like to be the first to know when enrollments open, please join the waitlist by visiting anigishiru.com/represented. Until next time.
We are represented. We are represented. We are represented.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Why don't you go ahead and hit that subscribe button and leave a review so this podcast can reach more online business owners, and together we can begin to normalize racial inclusion in the online coaching space. I'd love to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where this podcast episode was recorded, the Wiradjuri people in central New South Wales, Australia. Music produced in Nairobi, Kenya by Patrick St. P. Mbaru and Kambua Mathu. Vocals by Joanne Matata.
Represented.